Thank you for all the contributions, questions, suggestions from members of parliament. Again, this year I was struck by the fact that the speeches of the opposition and the nominated MPs and the PAP MPs were entirely fungible. I do not take that consensus for granted, and I express my gratitude on behalf of all my staff for your support for MFA. And I hope it's not just because this year MFA has regained its position as the lowest cost ministry in the government budget. But let me start by making 3 points. First, the world has become an even more dangerous place. In fact, if you look at the situation over the last couple of years, it has progressively become more dangerous. The second point, foreign policy begins at home. Domestic unity, cohesion, consensus within and outside this House is essential for us to conduct effective foreign policy. The third point is that our foreign policy must continue to be based on a realistic assessment of our national interests and our vulnerabilities. It cannot be driven by sentiment, emotion, or even affinities with external groups. Let me emphasize this. When we pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion, the MFA dimension to that pledge is that when we engage with foreign countries or foreign citizens, we must also do so regardless of race, language, or religion. No matter how close our hearts and our affinities are. And this is a point that we need to bear in mind. So, let me expand. The dangerous world. Last year, I spoke of a perfect storm of multiple interlocking crises. I was referring to the contestation between the US and China, the Russia-Ukraine war, climate change, the global economic disruptions, and the erosion of multilateralism. Today, the situation is worse. The war between Russia and Ukraine is headed into its third year, and the meat grinder, the casualties, mount on both sides, and there is no end in sight. Tensions between the US and China have calmed somewhat at a tactical level, but the deep strategic rivalry, the lack of strategic trust, continues apace. The bifurcation, or what some people will call decoupling, or more euphemistically, de-risking of global supply chains, continues. That unraveling is continuing apace. Now, this type of situation is particularly worrisome for Singapore because, after all, the US and China are our major strategic investment and trading partners. And the lack of strategic trust between them means that the risk of miscalculations that could easily spiral into a larger conflict cannot be discounted, especially over flashpoints like Taiwan and the South China Sea. The threat of climate change continues. I think 2023 was the hottest year on record for the past 174 years. We also stand on the precipice of a technological and economic revolution with the advent of generative AI and even the possibility of artificial general intelligence with its impact on jobs. Mr. Chairman, the tragic conflict between Israel and Hamas is the latest addition to this litany of woes. Given the appalling humanitarian tragedy, this conflict has quite understandably elicited a very strong response from both the international community as well as Singaporeans from all walks of life, from all our communities. It has ignited a debate over Singapore's foreign policy and how we should respond as a country. Indeed, in this contested, fragmented, and dangerous world, events in many faraway places, over which we have absolutely no control, will often have a profound impact on our economy and, in fact, sometimes put our domestic cohesion to the test. So let me come back to first principles. Singapore's foreign policy is based on several fundamental objectives. First and foremost, protect our independence, our sovereignty, our territorial integrity. Second, to secure our access to essential supplies, energy, water, food, and to keep air and sea lanes of communication open. This is existential for us. Third, to expand economic opportunities and to maintain our relevance to the world. Mr. Henry Quek, Mr. Chong Kee-hiong have emphasized this. And I want to quote Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in the speech he gave at the S. Rajaratnam lecture in 2009. Mr. Lee said, quote, "We have to live with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. We must remain nimble to seize opportunities that come with changing circumstances or to get out of harm's way," unquote. We are a small country with no hinterland, no natural resources, and in fact, no intrinsic relevance. We have to make our relevance to the world. We have an open and trade-based economy that will always be vulnerable to external forces and trends. And we remain a multiracial, multireligious, and multilingual society in the heart of Southeast Asia. To ensure our best chance for survival, there are a few things that we have to keep doing. First, we have to advocate for a rules-based order and full respect for international law. This is not an ideological position. This is a practical response. That it is the only way that small states will have a chance to live in peace without the constant specter of invasion from bigger neighbors. And this House has just passed the budget for MINDEF, and I stand in full support of that because, as Minister Ng said last night, we do not expect anyone to come to our rescue, to shed their blood for us. In fact, I can even add, I don't think we can bank on any superpower exercising their right of veto in the United Nations Security Council on our behalf. We are on our own. Sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity is and must be sacrosanct for Singapore. And what this means is being prepared to stand up and call out all violations of international law whenever, wherever it happens, and even if it displeases some of our stakeholders and some of our partners, or even neighbors. This was why we opposed Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and we condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and we remain, in fact, the only Southeast Asian nation to even have sanctions in place against Russia for that egregious act. We also spoke out against the American intervention in Grenada, 1983, and a more sensitive point closer to home, we opposed the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978. The reason we took these positions was not because we like to stand up and stake out a position, but because if we had stayed quiet, we would have implicitly agreed that might makes right and that powerful states can do what they can and the weak must suffer what we must. This goes against the very principles that undergird our existence as a sovereign, independent city-state. But today we are witnessing the erosion of multilateralism. We're seeing less cooperation across the world. We're seeing less unity on the global stage, less ability for the world to respond to planetary problems. In its place, we are witnessing the rise of nationalism, of xenophobia, of protectionism, of fragmentation, and in the political arena, frankly, populism. This is inimical to Singapore domestically and to Singapore globally. Because, in fact, if you reflect upon the past 6 decades of our independence, almost 6 decades, we have been beneficiaries of a rules-based, integrated global economy, and this has been one of the key dynamos for our success. International legal frameworks, like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, protects the right of all states for freedom of navigation and overflight, and to maintain open sea routes and sea lines of communication. These are vital to Singapore. This is why Mr. Vikram Nair raised the issue of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. We are not taking sides, but if anyone, state or non-state, for whatever excuse or pretext, interdicts maritime safety and maritime navigation, it affects Singapore. Members of this House may need to be reminded of our basic geography, that if you cannot navigate through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, if that route is closed, then the shortest route between Europe and Asia around the Cape of Good Hope is not the Straits of Malacca. You have to go further south and go through the Sunda Straits. So again, I'm trying to make the point that we take a position for our long-term national interests. That's why we contributed personnel to the multinational Operation Prosperity Guardian to protect freedom of navigation and to protect the key sea lines of communication in response to what we assess to be unlawful attacks on commercial shipping by the Houthis. This is about upholding principles, not about taking sides. Second, we must make common cause with as many partners around the world as possible. That means we will work with all countries on the basis of sovereign equality, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. To do this, we need to always bring value to the table. Our good standing today, quite frankly, my job as foreign minister is so much easier because I stand on the foundations laid by the pioneer generation, who showed the world they will stand up, would not flinch, they would defend Singapore's national interests, they would add value, we would act transparently and honestly, could be relied upon to be honest brokers. That makes the door open for today's generation of diplomats. And then we make sure that in any diplomatic conference, the Singaporean diplomats will be the most well-briefed, the most erudite, the most persuasive, and the most constructive people in the room. And the other big advantage, which makes my job so much easier, is that when any Singaporean minister or diplomat takes a stand on the international stage, it has been coordinated. He speaks not for himself or for MFA, he speaks for the whole of government, the whole of Singapore. So this is the way we have conducted foreign policy over decades, and how we have achieved a certain branding, a reputation for being consistent, constructive, and to look for win-win outcomes, but on the basis of mutual respect. So we have made a difference, and we are continuing to make a difference on the national stage, whether it is frontier issues like generative AI, or climate change, or digital economy, new energy, or sustainability. It's these same habits and attributes that keep recurring. And that's why we must continue to be a credible and honest partner, especially and even in the face of great power rivalry. And, you know, when many people ask us about US and China, implicit in their comments or the question is, which side are you going to take? And I have to keep reiterating, we will not become anybody's cat's paw or pawn or Trojan horse. We will be useful, but we will not be used by any other power. We will look at issues as and when they come up dispassionately, and we will always choose on the basis of Singapore's long-term national interests. That means from time to time, we will face pressure from countries almost always bigger than us who want us to bend to their will or at least to endorse their positions. But we will need to stand firm and to be prepared from time to time to say no, not in a gratuitous and provocative way, but because they know we have done our own calculations, we take a stand based on our assessment of our long-term national interests, and there's no point putting pressure on Singaporean ministers and diplomats, because if anything, we will dig in and we will hold the line even firmer. And this makes us relevant, gives us a degree of respect and ability to contribute on the global stage. So I think these are principles which have always guided our dealings with powers and partners, big or small, and that has enabled us to maintain good and significant equities with both the US, China, Russia, Europe, and all the middle emerging powers, Australia, India, Africa, South America. This year we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Suzhou Industrial Park, our first G2G project with China. This year is also the 20th anniversary of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, the first free trade agreement that the US signed with an Asian country. And we continue to reinforce our status as a trusted partner to both superpowers, even as we find new areas to deepen our cooperation. And it is important to be able to do that even whilst the two superpowers don't get along and don't have strategic trust and have not yet reached a modus vivendi. And we are trying to deepen cooperation and to maintain separate relationships with them that are still based on trust. Do you understand, appreciate the nature of that diplomatic challenge? Of course, we will continue to prioritize our relations with our neighbors, especially our two immediate neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, and of course, with ASEAN, and with the regional players, and as I said just now, with the emerging middle powers. And I'll leave Second Minister Maliki and Senior Minister of State Osman to give you more details on this later. Let me come back to foreign policy beginning at home. I've already mentioned the essential need for domestic cohesion and unity. This is absolutely essential and existential. If we cannot be united at home, how do we face the outside world with all its dangers, challenges, and risks? At independence, we were a society riddled with racial and religious fault lines. Our forefathers overcame this by setting aside differences, not erasing it. Those differences are still there, but making sure they did not become a source of internal tension and conflict. And our pioneer generation chose to put Singapore and Singaporeans first. They worked together for the collective good to build not a Malay nation or a Chinese nation or an Indian nation, They chose to build a nation that all of us equally could call home. But this is always work in progress. And our ethnic identities, our legacies, our connections, they are still useful for maintaining friendship, for establishing and expanding business connections. But fundamentally, even as we parlay our multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious ability, we must remember to look at issues and respond as Singaporeans first. When speaking, every time I go to the Great Hall of the People in Beijing or the Rashtrapati Bhavan in New Delhi, I'm always reminded that if my great-grandparents had not left India or China, I don't think I would be there as a guest of India or China. And then I look around at my delegation and look at the faces, and then I always point out to my interlocutors, look at my delegation. We are multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious. And I speak on behalf of Singapore and Singaporeans, not as an Indian or Chinese or Malay or on the basis of my religious identity. I'm reminded of that every time I go to the White House or go to any palace or any istana anywhere in the world. And this is the way we have to continue dealing with all countries, both those whom we have good friendly relations with and those whom we may temporarily have perhaps a little bit of tension because of disagreements on issues. So the point I'm making is that external issues and events will always have the potential to sow disagreement amongst us. It's hard-coded into our identity. Our diversity is both a strength, but also that same windows of opportunity also provide windows for influence, external, and for discord and divisiveness. This is not a bug. This is a design feature of Singapore. And so long as we remember that we must not allow centrifugal pressures to threaten our harmony and our cohesion, we can continue to take advantage of our diversity. So it is both a defining strength and a potential source of division. A variety of opinions is healthy, and it provides a foundation upon which we can make collective decisions as a country. But remember that we must always find that middle ground, make the compromises, arrive at the consensus. Because the moment we fracture, we are irrelevant. External issues can certainly polarize us. Russia's war with Ukraine was in fact a precursor, a preamble for us. We took the position to condemn Russia's invasion because it was a clear violation of international law. But there were competing narratives that were in fact opposed to the position that we took. They wanted us to choose a side instead of upholding principles. The war in Ukraine had significant economic impact. It certainly affected the price of energy, fertilizers, food. We felt it. It was part of the story of inflation around the world. But actually, it did not have all that much emotional resonance. Because I think, given our own makeup, the sense of affinity or identity is much less. But now, let's get real. The next episode, what's happening in Gaza, the Israel-Hamas conflict, it may actually have less, so far anyway, less economic impact, but it's got a very major emotional impact. And we should recognize that. The fighting in Gaza has resulted in a humanitarian crisis that is appalling. Anyone with a heart must ache with every picture, every video, every news report you read. Far too many innocent lives have been lost or maimed forever. The conflict in the Middle East is a complicated one. It goes back decades. In fact, it goes back centuries. Or if you want to go through history, you can even go back thousands of years. It is a chronic, difficult, painful, tragic, enormously difficult to resolve problem. But what happened on October the 7th? And I know I've had this debate with the leader before. We had to condemn that specific episode on October the 7th when Hamas launched an attack on civilians and took hostages. This was a blatant and abhorrent act of terrorism, which cannot be justified by any circumstance, context, historical reason, or justification. Now, why are we so obsessed with calling out terrorism wherever we see it? And we tell the world, no excuses, no pretexts, no justification. Why? The reason we take this stand again is not because we are taking sides or that we're trying to correct history or rewrite history. We can't. We're talking about conflict for thousands of years. We're only a country with 59 years of independence. No, we're not. We have taken that categorical stand because terrorism is a clear and present threat to Singapore. To excuse terrorism now, for whatever reason, in fact, puts Singapore at risk. Let me share with you, every time I read about rockets being fired, or an insurgent force killing, raping, maiming civilians, or taking hostages. Actually, the truth is on October the 7th, my thoughts were not so much in Gaza. I was thinking, if rockets landed in Bukit Panjang, if an insurgent force entered Woodlands, if 1,200 Singaporeans were killed, if 200 Singaporeans were kidnapped, that's what I was thinking of. So when I say foreign policy begins at home, I tell you, your foreign minister spends more time thinking about what if that happens here. What would we need to say? What would we need to do? What would be the job of my diplomats, and especially my permanent representative in New York, and if we had to face the Security Council? So I hope you understand why we have to be so categorical at times like this, even though we know it is an emotionally fraught moment. After the 7th of October attacks, we said we recognize Israel's right to self-defense. Again, it's not actually because I was really thinking of Israel or taking sides. We recognize Israel's right to self-defense because we will assert Singapore's right to self-defense if we ever face a situation like that. I have no doubt about that. It is not only our right of self-defense, but I think members of this House will agree it is our duty to protect our citizens. But even as we said there is a right of self-defense, we have consistently insisted that Israel must comply with international humanitarian law. And Israel's conduct must abide by the principles of necessity and proportionality, and Israel must comply with the laws of war, including the principles of distinction and humanity enshrined in the Geneva Conventions. Unfortunately, Israel's military response has gone too far. For avoidance of ambiguity, I'm going to repeat that line. Israel's military response has gone too far. The catastrophic situation in Gaza demands an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to alleviate the unbearable suffering of the civilian victims and to enable humanitarian assistance to reach them immediately. We are also concerned that there may be a potential ground offensive into Rafah, which will only worsen the situation further. We have made our position clear, both in my conversations with Israel and all our Arab friends and partners, and at the UN. We voted for the 2 UN General Assembly resolutions on the protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations, which called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Some people have told me that's not enough. We want you to sever diplomatic ties with Israel, recall your ambassador, engage in other performative diplomatic actions. Well, I need to tell everyone that we manage our international relations by remaining engaged with the international community and maintaining ties with as many countries as possible that are willing to maintain ties with us. As a small country, this is in our national interest. Ceremonially breaking ties with countries every time we disapprove of their actions, in my view, that's not constructive. This, whatever we say or do diplomatically, will not change the situation on the ground. Nor, I will add, will it influence Israel to suddenly change its policy, or will it necessarily immediately reduce the suffering on the Palestinians. None of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have broken ties with Israel. Even the Arab countries, Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, have diplomatic relations, continue to have diplomatic relations with Israel. I checked last night during a phone call. The ambassadors may or may not be present, but their staff are present, the embassies are present, and the embassies are open and functioning. Neither have ASEAN countries like Thailand, Philippines, or Vietnam broken off relations or closed their embassies in Tel Aviv. Ms. Rachel Ong asked how Singapore's relations with Israel will be impacted by the position that we've taken on the conflict. And clearly, they know that our position is not identical to theirs. I would say that we have been able to maintain good and respectful relations with the State of Israel, but I would also say that we have good and equally respectful relations with the Palestinian Authority. And all sides know that Singapore will always speak our minds, not provocatively, but because these are dearly held principles that we uphold, and that we will continue to maintain these positions guided by Singapore's long-term national interests and our unique circumstances. And whether or not you agree or disagree with us, it's not personal. It is a carefully considered national position. And quite frankly, I have never had to get into any shouting matches or disagreeable phone calls with any other foreign minister, regardless of circumstances. And it's not because I'm such an erudite and charming man, but because I am just the latest current foreign minister of Singapore, behaving true to form and holding fast to principles that have stood the test of time. I want to make one more point about the Israel-Hamas conflict. As I said just now, this is a long-standing conflict, complicated history. But it is worth emphasizing that this is not a religious battle. Religion is actually a veneer covering the heart of the conflict. What is the heart of the conflict? It's an age-old conflict, a fight over land, over identity, over power. This is an issue that goes back a very long time. And in fact, not just by tradition and not just because they all claim Abraham as their father, but even the latest genetic data. The Israelis and Palestinians are both Semitic tribes who have been fighting over this same sliver of land for such a long time. It's not possible for outsiders like us, no matter how we feel or don't feel about them and their identity and their culture and their religion. It's not possible for Singaporeans to decide or to determine who is right or who has a stronger historical claim. This long-drawn fight has been a tragedy. But this is only the latest chapter of a long saga of tragedy. Our hearts quite rightly ache at the bloodshed. But it is essential for Singaporeans to understand and appreciate that this is not our quarrel. And whilst we may feel a diversity of emotions on this, the worst thing would be to let this quarrel polarize and divide us as Singaporeans. Both Israel and Palestine have a right to exist. Israel has a right to live peacefully within secure borders, but the Palestinian people also have a right to a homeland. This is why, way back in 1988, I bet most people are not aware of that, back in 1988, we welcomed the proclamation of a Palestinian state. We are under no illusions that the path to an enduring peace will be easy. There is so much distrust and animosity, and the recent events have only made things worse. But for what it's worth, I tell all our friends and partners in the Middle East that Singapore continues to believe that a negotiated two-state solution consistent with UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338 is the only possible basis for a durable peace. Anything else will just condemn them to repeating the cycles of violence and tragedy. So we have consistently expressed our support for a two-state solution at the UN. We have consistently opposed moves that undermine a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. For example, we view Israel's settlements in the West Bank as illegal under international law. And we think, in fact, proceeding with the way they have proceeded over the last couple of decades after the failure of the Oslo Accords will only make things worse and makes it much more difficult to arrive at a two-state solution. And so we have voted in favor of every UN resolution that calls on Israel to rescind unilateral measures to change the status of Jerusalem, not because we have a view on how to settle the Jerusalem question, but because we believe this can only be done through direct negotiations between the two Semitic tribes, the Palestinians and the Israelis, directly arriving at a consensus, however long, however difficult that will be. Mrs. Zulkarnain Abdul Rahim asked how we have contributed to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Singaporeans actually have contributed generously with humanitarian assistance. The Singaporean NGOs and the government raised more than $10 million for relief operations to Gaza so far. I'm confident more will follow. Our strong ties with our partners in the Middle East have allowed us to collaborate with them on the delivery of this aid. So far, we've sent 2 tranches of life-saving aid for the civilians in Gaza. Minister Maliki was in Cairo in early November last year to personally hand over the first tranche to the Egyptian Red Crescent. And a few weeks later, we sent a second tranche that was delivered directly to El Arish, an airport in Egypt, near the Egypt-Gaza border. And this was delivered by an RSAF, our military aircraft. And in January 2024, you know that we also sent a SAF medical team to serve on board a French Navy ship to treat casualties from the Gaza. I told you just now, I spoke to the Jordanian foreign minister last night. We have agreed that we will donate a 3rd tranche of aid for Gaza, and this time we will work through Jordan. We will continue also our long-standing support for the Palestinian Authority's capacity-building efforts through our $10 million enhanced technical assistance package. As I said before, we have good ties with the Palestinian Authority. Prime Minister Lee, Senior Minister Teo, Minister Maliki, and I have visited Ramallah multiple occasions. We've met our counterparts there, and even during this crisis, I've been in phone contact with the Palestinian Authority foreign minister. We do all this because we look forward to the day when there's peace and that there is a functioning, capable Palestinian state, and that the Palestinian people get the peace and progress which they so richly deserve. And I mentioned earlier, we have also established a representative office in Ramallah in 2022. So I appreciate that many Singaporeans feel deeply about what is happening. But I also hope you can understand my point that foreign policy cannot be driven one way or the other by sentiment or affinity to any external group. Our foreign policy must be based on understanding our core interests and acting consistently in accordance with the principles that safeguard our independence, our sovereignty, our territorial integrity, and our security. Looking ahead, because of the state of the world, there's going to be many more foreign policy issues that are difficult, sensitive, prickly, and controversial. And the Israel-Hamas war is just the latest chapter. Can you imagine if there's a war between the US and China, or India and China, or between our neighbors, or in the South China Sea? Then it won't be just economics or just emotion. Everything will come to bear at the same time, both the economic and the emotional impact. And if that happens, if Singapore splits, polarizes, divides on the basis of affinity or history or identity, race, language, or religion, will be sunk. We'll be divided, we'll be weaker, we'll be vulnerable, we will not be independent, we will not have autonomy. I'm very glad that our community and religious leaders have tried to help our people better understand the conflict. Trying to help people understand this conflict is a very dangerous and difficult exercise. I mean, you can ask MOE about this. I'm sure Mr. Chan will explain more of that later on. But it is an essential exercise. Where else in the world can you get the chief rabbi and the mufti come together in the immediate aftermath of a horrendous attack and a catastrophic response? Where else in the world will a rabbi and a mufti come together in a public display of solidarity, call for stronger bonds between the Jewish and Muslim communities, and express their hopes and prayers for long-term peace? The mufti and the chief rabbi have both come in for criticism. They are brave people. They are principled people. They are people who have stood up not just for their communities, but have made Singapore a stronger, safer, better place. So this is a wonderful example of Singapore unity, cohesion, and compassion at its best. Let me end again by quoting Mr. Lee. I think he said this in 1966 when speaking to some university students. Quote, "We must be realistic. We cannot afford to indulge in emotional outbursts or in wishful thinking. We must face the hard facts of life, deal with them rationally and objectively." Mr. Chair, we have tried in MFA and all our diplomats to abide by these dicta. With your permission, can I ask Minister Maliki and Siman to continue?